What's up, Ryuji here. We are here in the Kikatsura mountain range and just had this really interesting outreach conversation, so to speak, with a monk who lives in this temple right here. But anyways, we were talking about all sorts of things and we were talking about veganism and I was talking to him about his opinion and it was really interesting the outcome that we had, and we had a long conversation in Japanese. It was kind of my first long outreach conversation in Japanese with a monk, no less, which was really interesting. But this video right here is kind of me and my friends talking about it after the fact and kind of debriefing the whole thing because we didn't film the actual conversation. He will be in Japanese anyways, but I just want to share this with you because I thought it was so interesting. It brings up a lot of interesting points about Buddhism and veganism, also the way that, you know, we all live in this world, and even though you might be a Buddhist monk like this guy right here, you still live in this world and you're still influenced by all the things that influence you as a person in this world. So anyways, I want to keep this intro short and we're going to jump into it right now, so enjoy. I was like, oh, what do you think about veganism? Like, what do you think about, like, you know, like living in a way that like you don't kill animals and stuff like that? And his basic position on the whole thing was, he said that whenever, as human beings, when we live, we have to take life from others anyways. So his position was that whether you're a human being, whether you're a dog, a cow, or whether you're a tree, basically, like, your life has the same worth. And as human beings, like, we have to, like, take their lives anyways. And so then I asked him about, like, but what about suffering? Because, like, you know, like, do you think there's a difference between, like, when you, like, say, cut off like a branch of a tree and, like, cut off the arm of a dog? And basically he seemed to, like, for him it was like kind of like he saw everything as equivalent, but in a way he also used that as like a justification to, like, keep, like, eating animals, because himself, like, he's not vegan or vegetarian. He said that, like, he's like 62 now, and he said until he's 60 he didn't eat animal, well, he couldn't really eat meat. Something about him, like, he couldn't, like, take it in. But then when he turned 60, he was able to, like, eat meat. So then, like, he started eating meat and he started, like, not really taking part in it. But basically he said that, well, as human beings, since we have to, like, take life anyways, he just accepts that. So that was his whole thing. And so I asked him about, you know, like, because then I told him about, for example, well, if you think that, like, do you think that we should minimize, like, the harm, like, in general, like, minimize the amount of lives we take? And so, like, he seems to, like, agree with all that about how, like, you know, when we do eat a plant-based diet, like, we are, like, we're taking less lives because we have to, like, kill plants to, like, feed the animals anyways.
Right.
And then, like, but what I thought was really interesting, like, overall, was how, like, at the end of the day, like it's so weird because it really felt like this whole Buddhist philosophy of, like, we have to take life anyways was being used as kind of like a justification to eat animals. Because I told him about, like, well, you know, today, like, in 2018, well, animals, like, suffer so much when you eat them. Like, it's not just that you kill them. And one thing that he kept talking about was like culture and tradition. And
Right.
you know, because he said that, like, you know, it's something that we've been doing for so long and we've been eating animals for so long, and so tradition is something that we should cherish and like take in. And then, you know, like, I asked him, like, whether he thinks that, well, is it because something, like, is traditional that, like, it makes it, like, right? And he said, like, of course not. But he was, like, kind of, like, vague on that whole thing, actually. Like, right. You know, like, because I asked him about, when Natalie told me to ask him about Taiji, like, I asked him and he was like, well, you know, like, we have to understand that back in the day, like, them killing dolphins was kind of, like, how they lived. And it was the basis of their economy and, like, the basis of, like, their whole, like, the whole place, basically. And he was like, back then, like, they didn't waste any parts of the dolphin. And I was like, well, what about now? And he's like, oh, like it's different, but, like, you know, but we have to, like, kind of, like,
but the tradition trumps.
Well, like, well, not necessarily trumps, but, like, we have to remember that.
Yeah.
And even so, like, because he was always talking about, like, he kind of shied away from, like, talking about his opinion. Because I specifically asked him about his opinion. I was
Right.
like, what do you think? And he was like, this is how the world is. And that's kind of, like, how he responded.
Right.
But I just thought it was so interesting because, to me, like, I mean, I don't know, like, the way that I understand Buddhism is about, like, compassion and about, like, and he even said at the end, like, you know, as one of the big differences between Eastern philosophy, like Buddhism, and Christianity is that, like, in Buddhism, there's no separation between, like, God and us. And we're all part of this world. Like, that's kind of what he said at the end. His closing remarks about the temple. He was like, a temple is a place where we all face this window where we were able to see ourselves as part of the world and part of everything that lives. And so I just think it's interesting because, like, as I was talking, that's kind of like the angle that I was trying to go, and I was trying to like basically talk in a way where I was like, yo, like, well, that for us, like, because I think that we agree with like a lot of like that philosophy. We agree that like, like that's why we're vegan basically, because we're like, hey, like all animals like kind of like deserve to like have a life, and we should like minimize the harm and like stuff like that.
Yeah.
So I was like going that way, but like again, it was interesting because for him, like it was very theoretical. And very like kind of like up in the air and very like, oh, but we have to take lives anyways. Well, kids, for us, like for me at least, I feel like being vegan is really about really facing reality. It's not just about like conceptual good and like conceptual,
conceptually, because you are killing some animals just because you're on the planet or just walking around, or that they're cultivating fields and some animals die. That our vegan premise is that's better than actually being part of a system where you are killing so many more lives and putting so many more animals in that position of having that amount of stress, that how much anxiety and fear and death and pain that they feel.
Yeah. No, 100%. And so, I told him that too. And one thing that he kind of like kept coming back to was that he was like, he thinks the world is going to change. He's like, we don't know how the world is going to change. And even when talking about Taiji, he was like, oh, but things are probably going to change. He said in the end, like, I don't think it's necessary for us to like, like kill dolphins. Because like one thing he said earlier was that like, if we have to do something out of necessity, then we have to do it. Which of course, like, well, it's not necessary. It's not necessary. But like one thing that he kept saying was like, he talked about how the world was going to change. But one thing that I thought was really interesting is because for us, we also think the world is going to change, except instead of just like hoping and wishing for the world to change, we're like,
we're trying to make it happen.
We're trying to make it happen through our own choices and through like all the activism that we do. And so like that's kind of like what I try to leave him with, because I was like, it's so interesting because like he sees these things about the world, but it didn't seem so much like he was taking responsibility for it and being like, he was kind of like, oh, we're just part of the world, this is what happens. It was very like accepting of what happened, and it was less taking responsibility for it and doing something about it, which I thought was like really interesting.
Of course, that's what lots of people feel to begin with. That's where most of us already started. This is the way it is.
Yeah, 100%.
So he's, in a sense, he might be a Buddhist monk, but he's still part of the society and the belief system in society.
Yeah, and that's so crazy because in my mind, I'm like, if you're a Buddhist monk, you basically should be vegan. Like, I don't understand how like that doesn't happen.
It does happen here in Japan, but it's a certain sect.
Exactly. And I'm like, I thought it was so interesting because I was like, wow, like, yeah, you're still up here, but you're still part of the society, and like, it doesn't matter. Like, you're still affected by the way that we're socialized into believing that things are normal and like stuff like that. And especially when you like kept bringing up tradition, I thought that was so interesting.
Yeah.
Because I was like, yo, like when you really think about it, tradition has nothing to do with what's right and what's wrong.
Right.
And like tradition is not. I don't think it's something that we should like take for granted and like cherish. I think it's something that we should question and see like kind of like what's right and wrong about it, then like move forward. Because I gave the slavery example because he was like, oh, but this is tradition, and I was like, yeah, but like
was tradition.
I was like, what about in parts of the world where slavery was traditional? Like, do you think that because it's traditional, not they should like cherish it and keep doing it? And he said, no, of course not. But he did call that example extreme though, which I thought was interesting because I mean it was just an analogy, like but
Well, kind of it is a strange thing to say because he's saying that each life is equal. So if you're talking about the like slavery of dolphins or the slavery of humans, it's the same thing.
Then why would that be extreme? If the animals are equal to us, why would slavery be okay? Not be okay for humans, but be okay for animals?
Yeah, I mean, I really think it's like just what you said earlier, which is he still grew up in this society.
It's just the way the world is.
And like most people do think that something like slavery is more extreme than say factory farming.
But it wasn't when it was happening.
Yeah.
Right.
When it was happening, it was mainstream.
Yeah.
Whereas
Very
today,
mainstream.
dolphin hunting may be mainstream, but 100 years from now, it may be viewed as extreme.
Which is that's the exact thing that like turned me vegan, because I realized that if I went back in time like 300 years, I would never support slavery.
Right.
Because now, like, with societal norms, like, slavery is just, like, done.
Yeah.
But, like, I realized that factory farming today is the same thing.
Yeah.
It's just that most of the world still thinks it's okay. It doesn't mean it's right. But if I wouldn't support that back then, how can I support this now? Like, I should
Exactly.
still, you know, like, yeah, so...